There is a command in the Old Testament that even the man who received it could not fully carry out, and when he came close, closer than almost anyone else ever did, he was rejected as king for it, not for refusing, not for failing, for almost obeying. Today, we're looking at one of the most uncomfortable passages in the entire Bible, the command to destroy the Amalekites, and a Hebrew word that most translations never explain. Once you understand what that word actually meant, the whole story stops being about cruelty and starts being about something much closer to home. Here's the command in 1 Samuel 15, verse 3. God, through the prophet Samuel, tells King Saul, "Now go and attack Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Read that again. Not just soldiers, not just the king, everyone, everything. For most readers, this is the verse that makes the whole Bible feel foreign, or worse, monstrous. Skeptics use it, believers avoid it, pastors quietly skip past it on their way to Psalm 23. And here's what makes it stranger. Saul actually does it, mostly. He gathers an army. He wins. He wipes out the Amalekite forces exactly as instructed. And then he stops, just short of the end. He keeps the Amalekite king, Agag, alive. He keeps the best of the sheep and cattle. Verse 15, Saul's own explanation, "The people spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God." He didn't loot the city for himself. He didn't run from the fight. He kept the best animals for worship. Here's the detail that should stop you before we even get to the rejection. Verse 12, before Samuel has said a single word of confrontation, Saul travels to a place called Carmel and sets up a monument to himself. Not an altar, not an offering, a monument to his own victory, on his own initiative, before anyone has asked him to account for anything. This is not a man anxious about what he might have done wrong. This is a man already commissioning the plaque. And for that, God rejects him as king. Not for the killing, for the keeping. If the story stopped at God commanded total destruction, you could argue about ancient warfare, hyperbole, genre. But the story doesn't stop there. It turns on one detail. A king who did almost everything right, punished more severely than if he'd simply refused the whole mission. That detail is the door into what this word actually means. The English translation, utterly destroy, flattens something the original language keeps sharp. The Hebrew word underneath it isn't a description of rage or overkill. It's a legal term. And once you know what it actually designates, Saul's story stops being about violence and starts being about theft. The word is Herem. Herem names a specific legal status, something removed from ordinary human youth and placed entirely outside the category of property. Once a thing is herem, no person may claim it, sell it, keep it, or benefit from it, ever. It belongs completely to one of two destinations, and there is no third option. Either it is handed over wholly to God, as treasury, as offering, or it is destroyed wholly, with nothing salvaged. Think of it less like a war crime and more like a legal seal. Herem means this is no longer available to be owned by anyone standing here. Not the winner, not the crown, not even the priest. This isn't the only time the word appears, and the earlier instance tells you exactly how seriously Israel's own writers took it. In Joshua chapter 6, the city of Jericho falls under Herem, everything in it devoted, off limits, not to be taken. And in chapter 7, one man, Achan, takes a portion of the silver and a beautiful cloak for himself and hides it under his tent. The result is not a fine, it's a national catastrophe. Israel loses its next battle at a town called Ai for a reason the text states plainly. One man treated Herem as if it were ordinary loot. The word carries that much weight 3 books earlier, before Saul was even born. So when Samuel gives Saul the same instruction generations later, an Israelite audience already knows exactly what Herem forbids, not just refusing to fight, but keeping anything back for yourself, even under a good excuse. Now the history. Why Amalek specifically? The command traces back to Deuteronomy 25, verses 17 to 19, Moses reminding Israel of something that happened decades earlier, right after they left Egypt. Amalek attacked Israel at Rephidim, not the army, not the front line, but the rear, all who were lagging behind, faint and weary, the exhausted, the stragglers, the ones who couldn't keep pace. By the standards of any ancient Near Eastern society, that's not warfare, that's ambush against the defenseless. And it's why Deuteronomy frames the judgment the way it does, blot out the memory of Amalek. Not a command about ethnicity, a response to a specific remembered act of cowardice against the weak, repeated across generations, since Agag's line kept the hostility alive. And notice the strange pair of instructions sitting side by side in that same passage. Verse 17, remember what Amalek did to you. Verse 19, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek. Remember and erase the memory in 3 verses. That's not a contradiction, it's a division of labor. Moses gives this instruction somewhere around 1400 BC. Saul doesn't act on it until roughly 1000 BC. That's the length of time this sentence sat in the text, waiting. It's also worth knowing who the Amalekites actually were historically, and not just as the villains of one chapter. They show up as far back as Genesis 14 in Abraham's era, as a people already occupying the Negev, desert raiders, not city builders, living by hit and run rather than settled agriculture. That pattern doesn't stop after Exodus 17. In the book of Judges, chapters 6 and 7, Amalekites join forces with Midianite raiders who strip Israel's crops and livestock so completely that Israel was brought very low. The same tactic, centuries after Rephidim, aimed at a different generation. This isn't a single grudge, it's a recurring generational pattern of preying on the exhausted and defenseless, and the penalty came with the strictest possible condition attached. Nobody profits from carrying it out, not even the king carrying out God's own command. There's one more detail almost nobody mentions, and it changes how you hear this whole conflict. Amalek isn't a stranger to Israel. Genesis chapter 36 traces the family line. Amalek is the grandson of Esau, Jacob's brother, which means this isn't a war between Israel and some distant foreign nation. It's a war within the same extended family, the great-nephews of Jacob attacking the descendants of Jacob, generation after generation. The hostility that started with 2 brothers wrestling in the womb never actually ended. It just changed its name. And this wasn't an idea Israel invented to justify itself either. In 1868, archaeologists uncovered a black stone in the ruins of ancient Moab, the Mesha Stele, an inscription carved by a real Moabite king boasting about his own military campaigns. On it, King Mesha writes that he devoted a captured Israelite city to his god Chemosh, the exact same practice from the other side. Israel's neighbors used this same category of total, no-profit destruction for their own gods. In an economy without paper currency, sheep and cattle weren't just food, they were wealth itself, the ancient equivalent of a bank account, tradable, breedable, visibly valuable to every soldier watching, and Agag wasn't just a prisoner. A captured king was a walking ransom, a diplomatic trophy, possibly even leverage for a future treaty. Saul wasn't tempted by scraps. He was looking at the two most valuable things on that entire battlefield and told himself that keeping the most valuable things was actually the pious choice. The bigger the best of, the easier it is to convince yourself it's an exception. That's the condition Saul broke.
Saul's sin was never that he fought too hard. It's that he helped himself to what was never his to take and called it worship to make the theft feel clean. Look at what Samuel says next, because it's the verse everyone quotes without knowing where it came from. 1 Samuel 15:22. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. Samuel is saying you cannot launder disobedience into an offering by giving it a religious name. Saul finally admits, sort of, I have sinned. But his next sentence gives him away. Please honor me before the elders of my people. He's not asking to be forgiven. He's asking to still look good in front of an audience. Samuel turns to leave. Saul grabs the hem of his robe and it tears in his hand. And Samuel says the line that makes the torn fabric an object lesson. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day. A visual pun staged in real time on the very edge of the garments Saul is grabbing to save face. In Numbers chapter 24, the same foreign prophet Balaam, trying and failing to curse Israel, says of Israel's future king, his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. Agag wasn't a title invented for one unlucky captive in 1 Samuel. It was already generations earlier the standard by which Israel's coming king would be measured. Agag most likely wasn't one man's personal name at all. It functioned the way Pharaoh did in Egypt, a royal title carried by whoever sat on the Amalekite throne generation after generation, meaning the High One or the Exalted One. Amalek was first among the nations, but its end is to perish forever. Nobody in that moment could have known it would take another 200 years and the rejected king to catch up with that line, but it was already written. Centuries later, in the book of Esther, a palace official rises to power in Persia and convinces the king to sign an order for the extermination of every Jew in the empire. His name is Haman, and the text doesn't just call him a villain. In Esther 3:1, it gives him a very specific title, Haman the Agagite. If that threat is right, the man who nearly wiped out the Jewish people in a single royal decree only existed to try because centuries earlier, a king in Israel decided a king's life and the best of the flock were worth keeping, for a good reason, in a good cause, just this once. That's what makes Herem a story about theft, not cruelty. The thing kept back is never small in the end. It just looks small on the day you decide to keep it. 1 Chronicles chapter 4 records that 500 men from the tribe of Simeon marched to Mount Seir and struck down the last remnant of Amalek that had escaped. No king, no famous battle, no prophet narrating it. Just a small, unremarkable military detail finally closing a sentence that had been open since Moses first spoke it 400 years earlier. Israel has just left Egypt. They've just complained about water and God provided it from a rock. And right after, Amalek attacks. Moses sends Joshua down into the valley to fight, while Moses himself climbs a hill overlooking the battle. As long as Moses holds his hands raised, Israel prevails. When his arms grow tired and drop, Amalek gains ground. So Aaron and Hur do something almost too simple to notice. They find Moses a stone to sit on, and they hold his arms up, one on each side, until sunset, and Israel wins. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, described Moses' outstretched arms on that hill as a foreshadowing of the cross, his posture prefiguring the shape of Christ's own arms outstretched at the crucifixion.
Read that way, the real battle in Exodus 17 was never decided in the valley. It was decided on the hill, in the posture of dependence, held up by others when strength ran out. The whole Amalek conflict, from the very beginning, was never about Israel's strength defeating an enemy. It was about staying in a posture of complete dependence, taking nothing for yourself, trusting that the outcome belongs to God alone.
Saul stood at the finish line of that exact story and reached for a souvenir. Understanding the legal weight of the word Herem doesn't erase every hard edge of this story. It should keep you honest, not comfortable. What the word Herem does is narrow the charge. This was never presented as destroy them because of who their ancestors were. Deuteronomy is specific. It points back to one remembered act, striking the exhausted and the falling behind from the rear when they couldn't defend themselves. The judgment answers a specific act of cruelty carried across generations, not a category of people.
The temptation in your own life is rarely a direct refusal of God. It's rarely, I won't do this at all. It's obeying 90% of the way and quietly deciding the last 10% is yours to keep and calling that good stewardship or wisdom or balance. So the honest question isn't, am I obeying God? It's smaller and harder. What's the best of the flock you're still holding back right now? And what have you been calling it so it doesn't feel like what it is? Maybe it's not a sheep or a king. Maybe it's a grudge you've relabeled boundaries, a compromise you've relabeled balance, a habit you've relabeled how I process stress. Saul didn't have to invent a lie to keep what he wanted. He just needed a respectable word for it. That's usually all any of us need too. Notice what Saul never does in the whole account. He never once claims God was wrong to ask. That's a much easier sin to commit than open rebellion, and the much harder one to notice in yourself, because it never feels like defiance. It feels like judgment, wisdom, being reasonable. Go back to that hill one more time. Moses doesn't win by being stronger than Amalek. He wins by staying in the one posture he can't hold on his own, arms raised, propped up by two other men until the sun goes down. That's the whole story underneath the uncomfortable verses. Not a God who demands more than we can give, a God who asks for nothing to be kept back, and who holds up our arms when we can't anymore. Saul stood on a battlefield he'd already won and reached for a keepsake instead of walking away empty-handed. Moses stood on a hill he couldn't have held alone and let two other men keep his arms in the air until it was over. Same war, same enemy, two completely different postures, and only one of them ends with a kingdom still standing.
If this changed how you read 1 Samuel 15, type "not partial" in the comments and subscribe if you want the next hidden detail explained like this one.